Hello everybody, my name is Dean Dwyer and this is our ongoing Prison of the Isms series. Now, if you've just joined us for the first time, this series is about Marxism, socialism and communism in particular. And if you haven't seen the previous videos, I'd encourage you, if you have time, to go back and look. There's 3 videos that precede this one. We started off with an introductory message in relation to the series, and then we moved on to the 1920s, and then also on to the 1930s to see the march of Marxism, socialism and communism throughout the world. And now this video focuses on the period of the 1940s. Now, if you know your modern history, of course, you'll immediately equate the period of the 1940s with World War II, and in particular, the deep and dark atrocities of Adolf Hitler. But since this series is about those philosophical isms, we want to examine how these isms, and particularly, as I said in the opening, Marxism, socialism and communism, shaped the 1940s and beyond. Well, look, above all, we must recognise, very sadly, the fact that World Wars I and II had resulted in an enormous loss of life throughout the world. If we look at the history books, estimates of the loss of life through the First World War range from 15 to 22 million people. It was supposed to be, we were told, the war to end all wars. Sadly, as we know, it wasn't. Barely 3 decades later, the world was at war again, and this time the result was far more deadly. Historians tell us that fatalities from World War II stood at around 75 million people. Just think about that for a moment. 75 million people lost their lives in World War II. At the time going on world population, that was 3% of the entire world population. Well, people look back on World War II and in somewhat simple terms would describe it as a virtuous war where the Allied powers had swooped in to save democracy, to protect democracy and to save the world from fascism. But is that the truth? And was it that ideologically simple? Essentially, you have to ask yourself this question: do the words and the actions of the leaders of that time support that view? Consider Benito Mussolini. He was the fascist dictator of Italy from 1925 to 1945. He was a close ally of Hitler during World War II and was considered a very central figure in the birth of European fascism. Yet, on January 20, 1927, at the Italian and Foreign Press Club in Rome, Winston Churchill had raised a glass to Mussolini and said these words, quote, "I could not help being charmed, like so many other people have been, by Signor Mussolini's gentle and simple bearing and by his calm, detached poise in spite of so many burdens and dangers. Secondly, anyone could see that he thought of nothing but the last good, as he understood it, of the Italian people, and that no lesser interest was of the slightest consequence to him. If I had been an Italian, I am sure that I should have been wholeheartedly with you from the start to the finish in your triumphant struggle against the bestial appetites and passions of Leninism." End quote. That was Winston Churchill speaking about Mussolini. Now, this of course was before Churchill became British Prime Minister. In fact, as I said, this was in 1927. This is when Churchill was Britain's finance chief, and he had just finalised negotiations with the Italians for them to pay £592 million to the British in disputed war debt, with the payments to last from 1930 right through to 1988. And do you know what? Of the £592 million that was negotiated, ask yourself how much of that was actually repaid. 0. Not 1 cent did Churchill end up extracting from the Italians. And so, although, as we see in Churchill's statement, Mussolini was praised as a reliable European partner, he was actually a very troubled and violent man. Not many people know that he was actually a socialist before becoming a fascist. In fact, after serving in the Italian army, he resumed his career as a teacher and a journalist, but he was often preaching violent revolution. He was praising Karl Marx and criticising patriotism. Mussolini, well, he was actually anti-church before becoming pro-church, or more accurately, he became pro-Catholic. As a socialist youth, Mussolini declared himself an atheist, and he often railed against the Catholic Church, going so far to say that only idiots believed in Bible stories and that Jesus Christ and Mary Magdalene were lovers. But after taking power and perhaps realising the power of the Catholic Church itself, his policies magically changed. He outlawed Freemasonry. He exempted clergy from taxation. He cracked down on artificial contraception. He campaigned for an increased birth rate, raised penalties for abortion. He restricted nightlife. He regulated women's clothing, and he banned homosexual acts among men. Now, despite having many mistresses himself, he'd also put in place harsh punishments for adultery. And in 1929, Mussolini signed an agreement with the Vatican under which the church received authority over marriage and was compensated for property that had been seized decades earlier. And so to Mussolini's many victims, the words of Pope Pius XI would have been sickening. He said Mussolini was, quote, "the man whom Providence has sent us," end quote. Well, it's a little known fact that in the mid-1920s, many in the British aristocracy had become convinced of the superiority of fascist regimes when compared to the perceived failures of democracy in Britain. Not only did the British admire Mussolini's statesmanship in international affairs, they admired his ability to actually stabilise the Italian economy at the time. And if we look at things from a distance, his achievements seemed impressive. 5 years of consistent rule put an end to strikes and class war. Taxation and unemployment fell. The government's annual revenue became a surplus, and increased support of agricultural production connected with many British conservatives who had suffered with the collapse of agricultural prices during the 1920s. Now, this is where people express surprise. How could a democratic and free nation like Britain fall for the allure of fascism? Well, can I say that it is often connected back to the economy? And we just saw that in the list that I just presented. Leaders will often use the economy as a metric of their success. And might I say that in our nation, in Australia today, many of our leaders are exhibiting the same desperation to restore a broken economy. But the danger that brings is often this subtle slide from democracy into fascism, particularly this medical fascism that is currently being displayed in this nation. Now, we must say that Churchill was not a fascist, but he did admit that even in Britain, fascist methods for countering communism remained an option. Now, thankfully, as we know, the British didn't go down this path because all that would have done is to imprison Britain to fascism in the aims of fighting communism. It's like someone just exchanging one prison for another. You're still in bondage. It's just that your chains look different. Well, over in Germany, in an earlier video I referenced Bolshevism, and it's entirely apparent that Hitler, during his reign of terror, was very much opposed to it. In fact, he believed that the Jews were behind Bolshevism, communism, and Marxism. But, seemingly forgotten by many people today who glorify Churchill and his period in office in Britain, he had actually had very similar views. He made a distinction between Bolshevik Jews, whom he actually detested, and Zionist Jews, whom he saw as a counterbalance to the ideology and views of the Bolshevik Jews. In fact, in his mind, national Jews, which was defined as those who had assimilated into their European homelands, were to be admired in the views of Churchill, but he condemned, quote, the schemes of the international Jews, end quote. And this is this ongoing anti-Semitic trope that the Jews are responsible for all of the evil international conspiracies. Can I say again, and I've raised this in an earlier video, when we talk about these ideologies, we do recognise that a lot of Jewish men were involved in them. This is not about anti-Semitism at all. We cannot proclaim hatred towards a people group because they've been involved in some of these political ideologies. This is not anti-Semitic in nature, and anyone who uses the history books to proclaim anti-Semitism or something against the Jewish people, I entirely renounce that completely. The Jewish people, the Israelite nation, are God's chosen people. And in Genesis 12:3, we are told that a nation who blesses the Jews will be blessed, and a nation that curses the Jews will in turn also be cursed. So in our fellowship, we have a deep and rich history of love towards the Jewish people. We love the Jewish people because they're God's chosen people. But it is interesting to see this thread that's been throughout history, this lie of Satan that the Jews are to be blamed for every evil in the world. It is simply a lie from the father of lies. And please, I implore you to stay away from it. Now, in terms of Churchill, his interest in keeping the Jewish movement free of communism was actually, if you examine Churchill's life, it was a consistent theme right throughout. You see, the prominence of individual Jews in senior positions in the communist revolutions which occurred in Russia, Bavaria and Hungary, they had alarmed Churchill since the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. And so, writing about this in 1920, he urged the Jews to abandon communism and either enter into the national life of their own countries, while still encouraging them, of course, to adhere to the Jewish religion, or to opt for Zionism. Okay, so what he was talking about was, okay, either you stay in your European homelands, you assimilate into European culture, but you keep your identity as religious Jews, or you try and find a way back to the homeland and embrace Zionism back in your ancestral homeland. And you need to remember at the time that Churchill wrote these words, Israel didn't exist. Remember that it wasn't until May 14, 1948 that the modern state of Israel came about. So we can see that he was entirely supportive of a Jewish homeland in the traditional Holy Land, which we affirm is the aim of Zionism. But there was a rider to that, there was a waiver to that. Just as long, in his mind, that the Jews embraced Judaism and nationalism, but not communism. Well, the question needs to be asked, why were all of these European leaders so afraid of Bolshevism? Why were they so afraid of the ideology behind Bolshevism? In fact, the fear of Bolshevism is a defined phobia. Even today, it is called Bolshephobia. And according to one historian, Churchill said that the Bolsheviks are the enemies of the human race and must be put down at any cost. They were Churchill's words. Lloyd George, he was a former UK Prime Minister some decades prior to Churchill. He remarked at the time how, as an aristocrat, Churchill's blood ran cold at the fate of Russian nobility during this revolution. In fact, Churchill explained in simple terms to Lloyd George in 1919 his preference for actually how to deal with Bolshevism. And he reflected that in these few words: feed Germany, fight Bolshevism, make Germany fight Bolshevism. See, what many people forget is that the British ruling class, they were pro-German as long as Hitler faced east, as long as he faced the Soviet Union. And writing in 1937, Churchill said these admiring words of Hitler, quote, "One may dislike Hitler's system and yet admire his patriotic achievement. If our country were defeated, I hope we should find a champion as indomitable to restore our courage and lead us back to our place among the nations." End quote. Now, the British people can be thankful that they never had to determine if that was true in their own country. Now, people become thoroughly confused about Hitler's aims and his political ideology, which is often clouded, of course, by his resolute hatred of the Jewish people. And although some try to argue that Hitler was not a true socialist because he railed against communism and actually went to war with Stalin, those claims are in fact, in my view, completely false. The feud between fascists like Hitler and communists of his day was not about freedom versus oppression or centrally controlled economies versus capitalism. It was primarily focused on whether socialism should be nationalistic, which we know is what the Nazi Party stood for, or whether it should be global. In fact, in a 1923 interview, he specifically said, "We are not internationalists. Our socialism is national." Now, if you want an example of global socialism today, look no further than Agenda 2030. And if you've never heard of this agenda, I would encourage you to look it up, look at the principles behind it, look at what they want to do in relation to governance of the planet as a result of it. Because you see, Agenda 2030, the agreement around it, makes the audacity of the scheme very clear. There was a document released in 2015 and it says as follows: "This is an agenda of unprecedented scope and significance. The agenda is a plan of action for people, planet, and prosperity." Other words, it involves everybody, whether you like it or not. It goes on. "It also seeks to strengthen universal peace in larger freedom. We recognise that eradicating poverty in all its forms and dimensions, including extreme poverty, is the greatest challenge and an indispensable requirement for sustainable development. All countries and all stakeholders acting in collaborative partnership will implement this plan." In other words, whether you like it or not, this agenda has been agreed to on behalf of all countries and on behalf of all people. Now, it's couched very much in non-threatening language, but it is essentially global socialism that will redistribute wealth from wealthy nations to poorer nations. Anyway, back to Hitler and Stalin. And in the end, the fascism v communism debate was always going to be a lose-lose affair for everybody involved, not just on a leadership level, but also on a citizen level also. All of these ideologies, all of them, they all lead to totalitarianism because both and all are based on the individual succumbing to the state's will. And all of them result in murder and subjugation. That's why we call this series the prison of the isms. At best, people are going to be imprisoned. At worst, as we've seen with fascism, communism, in some socialism examples as well, what it leads to is the death of people through starvation, poverty, or being killed by their own ruling governments. Now, let's get back to our friends in the Frankfurt School. And if you haven't seen some of the earlier videos, we talk about the inception of the Frankfurt School and why it's important to understand the work of the Frankfurt School, of the Institute of Social Research it became, throughout the decades. So this is what the series is all about, examining who was crucial in all of this and how it started to evolve, beginning in Germany and then moved on into the US, because some of these people were particularly active during the period of World War II, despite the fact there was obviously global chaos ensuing. There were three prominent members who worked as intelligence analysts for the Office of Strategic Services. Now, the OSS became another alphabet agency called the CIA, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, the Central Intelligence Agency of America. So these three people I reference: Franz Neumann, Herbert Marcuse, and Otto Kirchheimer. In fact, their analysis of Nazism, so they were tasked with building a case against Nazism, and they played a central role in the development of post-war Allied policy, which included the principle of denazification and the preparation of the famed Nuremberg trial. So they did some very good work in setting things up so that the Nazi Party could be tried at Nuremberg. In fact, one Cambridge philosopher believed that the Research and Analysis branch of the OSS, which was created in 1943, it had staff of more than 1,200 people. So this was a massive branch of the OSS. He believed that it was assembled on the basis of the belief, get this, that Marxism could be harnessed in the defeat of fascism. So that's just using another prison-taking ideology to try and defeat another one. Again, they both lead to imprisonment, enslavement of the population, and no good can come of using one against the other. Now, the Nazis, of course, they were soundly defeated, but it's doubtful as to whether Marxism was the defining weapon in their defeat. What did become very clear is that the Americans had no idea that they had unwittingly invited an ideology onto their shores that would begin changing their culture very, very soon after the war had ended. And we're excited to look at that 1950s period and beyond as we get to future video series. Now, although the focus of Herbert Marcuse's work during his time with the OSS was the defeat of Nazi Germany, he did produce some seminal works during World War II and its aftermath. And these works were intended to focus on the social relevance of something called critical theory, which Marcuse forcefully argued in his 1941 work called Reason and Revolution, Hegel and the Rise of Social Theory. Now, if you aren't sure who George Hegel is, again, I touch on his influence in an earlier video, and his influence was through something called the Hegelian dialectic. So I'd encourage you, if you haven't done so, if you're joining us for the first time, go back to the original video. We explain how the Hegelian dialectic works. Essentially, he had proposed that solutions are found through a dialectical method of argument, so that every issue that comes upon society is filtered. So it's filtered through this process of thesis, antithesis, in order to achieve synthesis. Or, in simple terms, there's a problem, there's a reaction, and there's a solution. Now, essentially, it's a school of thought around contradictory processes from opposing sides. Okay, so you've got thesis, antithesis, they clash, it's a contradictory process, and that brings forward a synthesis. Problem, reaction, solution. Now, sometimes that occurs naturally, but other times, and this is the problem, and this is where you really need to look at events that happen through the lens of the Hegelian dialectic, because sometimes it might happen organically, but sometimes some very clever, wicked and devious people use it as a principle to manipulate a situation. So it's always handy, I say to people, that when you view a situation, particularly globally, particularly if there's organisations or people trying to move society in a predetermined way, you've got to see if they're implementing a dialectic, particularly the Hegelian dialectic of problem, reaction, solution. So if they want to get to a predetermined solution, what problem and reaction do they need to manipulate or create in order to move society towards that solution. Now, in the early 1940s, there is some suggestion that Marcuse's social theory ultimately became more compatible with those of Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, in that they had a pessimistic one-dimensional outlook on the chances of social change. Now, what this thesis pretended was that culture was becoming post-liberal, and with that, non-contradictory in nature. And that's important to understand because, as I just said, to employ the Hegelian dialectic in a situation, you have to have contradictory processes. You have to have problem, you have to have reaction in order to get solution. So for these men who came up with this theory that society was moving in a post-liberal fashion and there were not going to be any there were not going to be any contradictory processes in future, how could they drive social change? How could they manipulate social change if there wasn't going to be a problem and a reaction? Think about that. It's a very nefarious way to look at the world. But again, some of these men wanted to drive social change. And the only way that they thought they could do that was with this social theory of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, always moving society with this problem, reaction, solution dialectic so that they could move social theory in a particular manner and in a particular way. So, what to do if you're a person who wants to promote cultural change? And this is the point that Marcuse had reached. If America was in fact moving in a post-liberal fashion where there would no longer be these contradictory processes, how do we change that? How do we change that so that he can employ this social theory in order to drive this social change? Well, naturally, Marcuse attempted to re-establish an adequate relationship of dialectical philosophy to critical social theory. And it was about this time that Horkheimer and Adorno had started to move away from social theory and focused more on cultural critique. But as far as Marcuse and Franz Newman were concerned, they believed this as follows, and I quote, "Every particular form of existence contradicts its content, which can develop only through breaking this form and creating a new one in which the content appears in a more liberated and more adequate form." You might have to replay that to get the true picture behind that statement. But again, they believe that society needs to clash. Society needs to clash. This old form needs to clash with this new form in order to bring forward a better form, in their view. Sometimes, as we've seen through history, it brings forth a worse form. Look at the rise of Hitler. That brought such evil upon the world. So these men were playing with fire in that they didn't know what they were going to bring forward because there was some randomization almost in this concept of problem, reaction, solution, unless it is a predetermined solution that very clever people know they can manipulate in order to move society to a predetermined platform or solution. Now, again, think about it. You've always got to think about the situations in society that you are seeing, even in Western nations. What are you seeing in society that is moving people towards a predetermined solution? And again, this series is about enslavement. That is why it's called the Prison of the Isms series, because all of these isms lead to enslavement. These people will talk to you about freedom, and we'll come across in the 1950s and 60s in particular, this concept of eros, this erotic freedom, this sexual freedom. But what does it lead to? It leads to oppression. It leads to a breakdown of the family. It leads to a breakdown of marriages. It leads to the rise of pornography. So it enslaves people in sin. These people proclaim that it will bring freedom to society, but it enslaves in sin. And this is what these people are not understanding in terms of the spiritual aspect. And this is why a lot of these were atheistic people in nature. So they didn't understand that there was a spiritual element behind that, because a lot of them were ethnically Jewish, but they weren't religiously Jewish. They didn't understand that there is a true and living God that cares about people and that wants people to be free from the enslavement of sin. That's why Jesus Christ came, shed his blood on the cross so that we could be free of all of this. But this is the spiritual aspect that these people don't understand. Now, Marcuse and Newman, Franz Newman, they started to really think along the same lines. And Marcuse, though, had failed to secure the collaboration of the other ISR members. Remember, ISR, Institute of Social Research. And so he failed to secure some of the collaboration of the other members in establishing a theoretical nucleus aimed at social change in the period after World War II. And so in essence, and this became actually very clear in Marcuse's 33 thesis, which was written in 1947, he was beginning to follow the philosophy of actually what we refer to as Hegelian Marxism, which is the combination of Hegelianism and Marxism. So it was in some ways, though, an odd combination because of the differences in how Hegel and Marx had approached their theories. But many Marxists in particular don't realise that Marx was actually heavily influenced by Hegel, even though he was obviously very critical of Hegel's work. Broadly, they'd worked towards the same goal, but obviously had different methods of trying to achieve that goal. And it was essentially World War I which had marked this almost natural decline of this organic or naturalistic Marxism and the rise of this Hegelian Marxism, which was used as a theory to explain away this failure of the socialist movement as a result of World War I. Now, the most stark difference between Hegel and Marx would be focused on or centred on which class of society would be the agents of change. Again, social theory is all about using elements or key groups in society to drive social change. You're not going to drive social change just as a philosophical movement. It has to be involved, it has to have people involved in it. So Hegel believed that it would be the elite who would drive change rather than, as Marx believed, it would happen through violent revolution, so through the blind destruction wrought by mobs and factory owners. So although he supported the rights, this is Hegel, although Hegel had supported the rights of the oppressed to throw off the oppressors, he believed, and this was particularly relevant in the case of Germany, that revolution would occur through the perfection of the state, which in turn would guarantee freedom to its citizens. However, and this is the thing, and you look at our nation today, and this is where you just have to laugh at sometimes the philosophy of our leaders. They believe that the state is perfect, that the state can govern in a perfect way. It absolutely cannot. The government is not God. Government is setting itself up to be God, and a false God at that. And you see a lot of blind obedience to the government at the moment. And might I say, for those people, generally they're atheistic. And so government is their God. And so of course they're going to be obedient to their false God, because after all, that's what you do. If you believe in a false God, you're obedient to a false God. Just as believers, we believe in the only true and living God. That's why we're obedient to him. So this concept of a perfect state, as Hegel believed, will not exist outside of the perfect rulership of the Lord Jesus Christ when he comes to rule and reign physically and visibly from Jerusalem after the tribulation period has ended and the second advent of Christ manifests itself and the millennial reign begins. See what Hegel brought forward, what Marx brought forward, what Lenin, Stalin, all of them, Mussolini, what they brought forward was the belief that they could usher in some type of governance which would suit the people, and in Hegel's case, the guarantee of freedom to its citizens. We know that this simply amounted to the rise of fascism and the terrible, enormous loss of life, particularly amongst the Jewish people. So this was just a warped ideology and warped thinking in believing that a perfect state could guarantee the freedom of its people. 1873, Marx said that his dialectic method, so he employed a dialectic method as well, there are multiple out there, that it was not only different to Hegel's, but its direct opposite. So where Marx believed that Hegel went wrong was the fact that Hegel was all too inclined to believe that the intellectual elite of society could use speculative logic to theorise in advance of the real development. So he believed, Hegel, that we take the intellectual elite and they'll theorise what's going to happen in advance of actually what happens. It's like in armed forces terms, you've got a reconnaissance unit. So you send the recon unit out in advance of the real army, of the armed forces that are coming in behind. So he believed that you could rationalise or theorise ahead of what would actually happen. And this was really idealistic in nature. But Hegel's idealism is also reflected in the fact that Hegel always looked to the intellectual and social elite to solve problems and regarded the masses as more or less destructive forces of nature. Whereas on the other hand, Marx, he looked to the workers' movement as the true vehicle of social progress. Unfortunately, well, ultimately, where did Marx and Hegel see society going? Because unfortunately, it went absolutely in the wrong direction. You see, they both shared the view that humanity was a product of society and history that went through, again, this series of dialectical developments whose final end is the realisation of freedom. Do you get this? They truly believe that this dialectical method, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, that eventually this would lead to perfect freedom. This is the irony in these ideologies, is that they did not and will not lead to freedom. They resulted in Marxism, socialism, communism, which has been incredibly destructive to world systems and has caused enormous loss of life. Can we affirm and attest to the fact that the only person who can give you freedom is Jesus Christ? He died on the cross to secure your freedom. His shed blood sets us free. We still live in this world. We're still subject to these ideologies, but we are free. The truth has set us free. Back to critical theory. Now, the definition of critical theory sounds harmless enough. It is, by definition, an academic tool that allows people to critique society with the hope of changing society for the better. Sounds all very idealistic, doesn't it? But when academics such as sociologists use critical theory, they are not merely hoping to describe society. This isn't some theoretical philosophy. They want to change it, and they will do whatever they can to drive change in it. You see, critical theory is about criticising society with a goal of forcing change in a new direction. And of course, that new direction involves the erasure of capitalist ideology embedded particularly in Western culture. So like Marxism, critical theory utilises this oppressor-oppressed dichotomy to describe society, and it critiques all of society as it currently is. So it goes after tradition, authority, and morality. In fact, it has a long list of targets, including, right at the top, Christianity, capitalism, civil authority, the family, the patriarchy, hierarchy, morality, tradition, sexual restraint, loyalty, patriotism, and nationalism. You see, In this age, we make a bit of a joke about political correctness, but political correctness basically came out of critical theory. And it's deadly, seriously deadly, in its aims. It seeks to impose a uniformity of thought and behaviour on all citizens. Can I say that again? It seeks to impose a uniformity of thought and behaviour on all of its citizens. Again, what is it? It's an ideology which leads to the physical enslavement of people. They want to control your mind, they want to control your body, what you can do with your body, what you put into your body, as is the case at the moment. Therefore, what do we say it is? It is totalitarian in nature. Critical theory sounds benign. It is totalitarian in nature because the intent is to intimidate dissenters into compliance with accepted dogma. Look at how that worked out in the past and look at how it is working out right now in our own nations. What is the goal of critical theory? Well, it's utopian in nature. It dreams of a future where there are no hierarchies, no disparities between people, in which supposedly it will bring perfect equality. Again, these people truly believe they can drive social change so much that eventually the synthesis is that there will be perfection and equality in all ways. And so this is the insidious part of critical theory and neo-Marxism, is that they do not wear, though, their ideologies on their sleeve. Rather, they use a lot of this benign-sounding language, and they couch their revolutionary ideas in language like tolerance, equality, love, acceptance, etc., and etc., which of course is all throughout our cultural discourse at the moment. But worse, it demands the replacement of Christian morality as the default morality that many Western nations were founded upon. Okay, so you get the idea. It wants to do away with the Christian foundation of morality and of teaching, and it wants to substitute its own definition of what is morally acceptable in society. And so this so-called quiet revolution focuses on these 11 key areas: the creation of racism offences, continual change to create confusion, the teaching of sex and homosexuality to children, the undermining of the authority of schools and teachers, huge immigration to destroy identity, the promotion of excessive drinking, the emptying of churches, an unreliable legal system with bias against the victims of crime, dependency on the state or state benefits, control and dumbing down of the media, and encouraging the breakdown of the family unit. Now, you reflect on that list and think about your own nation, and you tell me how successful you think they've been. Wildly successful, because all of those 11 points are happening right now, and they've been happening for a good long while now. Well, further, the Frankfurt School determined to overthrow traditional relationships between men and women, but they also had some further aims: attack the authority of the father, deny the specific roles of father, and wrest away their families from their rights as primary educators of their children. Okay? So, take down the role of father. Government wants to be the father of your family, so cancel the rights, obligations, the roles of the father, so that the state can step in, and rather than the father and the parents teaching the children, the state wants to be the educator of your children. Why? So that the state can infuse their ideology into your children. They want to abolish the differences in the education of boys and girls. They want to abolish all forms of male dominance. And they want to declare women to be an oppressed class and the men as oppressors. You see, this cultural revolution demolishes from within. This is what happens, but not straight away. It happens over a long period of time. And these people, these ideologies that are behind them, they are incredibly patient. This is why they call this the long game, the long march through institutions, because they knew that this wasn't going to happen overnight. But they've really kept their eye on the target. And we've just gone through those list of targets as well. The family, education, media, sex, and popular culture. They are the specific targets always of these people. You know, in the end, though Marxists proclaim they can build a societal utopia built on equality, their philosophy will actually make social life intolerable. And that's the key point. As I said to you earlier, the point is that these ideologies, though they're couched in this non-threatening language, though they are sold to the people on the basis of equality, wealth distribution, we're going to look after people, planet and prosperity. The climate change movement is all wrapped up in this. You really need to examine the claims behind the Great Reset and Agenda 2030, Agenda 21, preceding that for many, many years as well. The goal is they still have this goal of wanting to create a global utopia for all people. Now, the problem is that the most dangerous thing that you can do is think for yourself. And that is what this series is about. You need to be able to critically think and critically examine what is happening in society. And I trust that some of this information will give you the tools to do that. Because once you see what's going on, once you see the agenda, once you see the tools that these people use, you won't look at things in the same light ever again. And that's why I believe in this series. That's why I believe this series is so important. Because you can't understand 2020 until you understand 1920. And so next time, we're going to go through into the 1950s. Now, World War II was somewhat a distraction. Obviously, people needed to focus on what was happening in Germany, in Europe, as a result of World War II. But once the distraction of World War II was out of the way, well, these people could go to work and they would immediately turn their attention to the very institution they had set their sights on. And can I say, the results for American culture would be devastating. They would be irreversible, and we are seeing the effects of that even today, or even more so today. This ideology had irreversibly changed America, beginning right at the 1950s and moving on and on and on as generations started to adopt a lot of these ideologies. So that wraps up the 1940s. Lots of information in it, but we really only scratched the surface. We've really only given you some basic information, and I trust that will be a bit of a springboard to go on and do your own study, see what's going on, critically think, and most of all, use the Bible, because the Bible is absolutely the only source of truth in this world. So we need to be sticking close to God, being obedient to Him, following the direction of the Holy Spirit and not the direction of these men, particularly wicked men who want to take this world in a direction that is the complete opposite of what God has in mind. But be encouraged as well. You know, we don't want to end this video by being disappointed or discouraged about what's happening, because even though these people have their own agenda, can I say that God reigns? He is sovereign, He rules all, and all are under His control. He uses both the righteous and the unrighteous, and He is using some of these people in order to bring about His will for this world. And I trust that if you're watching this and you are unsaved, you haven't accepted the Lord Jesus Christ as Saviour, may I say this: all of these world systems are going to be destroyed at the Lord's second coming. But before that, there is a horrible, horrible period to come upon the earth called the time of Jacob's trouble. And we want to make sure that people understand that there is no hope to be found in man. There's no hope to be found in mankind's philosophies. There is hope only to be found in the Lord Jesus Christ. And we praise His name for being able to bring this series to you, and we trust we'll see you next time.